Our African leaders have called for the removal of sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe by a law the United States Congress passed back in 2001. This was during the late Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe's regime. At the recent United Nations General Assembly, President Cyril Ramaphosa and the African Union chairperson Macky Sall spoke about the need to remove the restrictions. Well, let's get perspective now, and we're joined by Gideon Chitanga, who is a research associate at the African Center for Studies at Wits University. Mr. Chitanga, thank you very much for your time. The justification for these sanctions by the U.S., this is what they said at the time, and I quote, targeted financial sanctions against select members of Zimbabwe's ruling elite for undermining democratic processes, abusing human rights, or facilitating corruption. Is that still the case? Can it be argued, therefore, that these targeted sanctions are the ones that are collapsing the country's economy?
To put things in a broader context, I think there are quite a number of factors, but clearly sanctions have had a major impact on the economy of Zimbabwe. If you recall, the statement that you quoted actually framed the sanctions as in 2000 and 2002 when they were imposed, 2001 and 2002 when they were imposed by the US and the EU respectively. And the context of the sanction was the heightened polarized contestation between the MDC and ZANU-PF, Morgan Tsvangirai and Robert Mugabe. So the impact, the direct impact is broader or has been broader than what is articulated in the framing or the wording or the rhetoric of the sanction as it has been expressed by Western powers. The collapse in agriculture, the closure or collapse of investment, the rapid inflation which actually became like an implosion by about 2008, and the collapse of all public sectors. The unemployment has grown or skyrocketed. If you look at 2000 to where we are now, I think Zimbabwe's unemployment is close to 90%. Unemployment and underemployment. The shortage of foreign currency, which is both emanating from lack of investment, or the flow of new capital into Zimbabwe for more than 2 decades. So the consequences are broader than what the language of the sanctions says in terms of targeting individuals and stopping those individual activities, and there are obviously significant negative implications.
Well, let's explore that a little bit, and I'm sorry to cut in. Let's explore that a little bit. Why has the impact of these sanctions been broader than what the text says, and that is that these are targeted sanctions against the ruling elite who have undermined human rights? So why the negative effect on trade and investment?
You see, So I think that the language at the time was meant to draw a block of players to be involved in executing and imposing these sanctions. So the language is relatively softer in contrast to the impact or the outcome. But if you look at the direct impact, and I think there's a lot of evidence from the behavior of the IMF, for example, towards Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, for the past 2 decades, has not had any new capital or exercised any borrowing rights from the IMF. It has not had grants from the West. Its trade with the West basically stopped. So once you start to look at it in that way, you see that these sanctions they go beyond the individuals that we are talking about. In a very broader way, they frame the state of Zimbabwe as a country and a government, as a society that is paid for investment, even by just considering what is said in the language. So, hence the broader societal impact that African leaders in the SADC and the AU have expressed. At a political level, the government of Zimbabwe is and has said that clearly that our problem are sanctions. The other way of looking at it is that if you look at other investors who have gone in Zimbabwe, they faced immense challenges. Until 2005, China had invested approximately 7 billion, and up to this point, maybe they doubled that. But if you look at the problem such investment faces in the Zimbabwean context, you will see that sanctions have crippled the economy from agriculture, from manufacturing, and all the other sectors that you can think about. So the impact is broader, it goes deeper, and it's more extensive than just targeting the economic activities of these political individuals that are referred to, and other business elites who are seen who were seen at that point as compounding the what was called the Zimbabwe crisis.
Yeah, Mr. Chitanga, successive U.S. administrations have gone on to renew these sanctions. Does that suggest that despite the elections that have been held in Zimbabwe since the imposition of these sanctions, their view in the U.S. government is that nothing really has changed in Zimbabwe?
It's possibly that, and with regards to that, I think that the policy at the time at the time when the sanctions were passed, the Western policy was centered on what was called then regime change, which basically meant they were looking at removing ZANU-PF from power and not any other dimensions of democracy that could emerge, and the opportunities such dimensions would offer in terms of moving Zimbabwe forward. So to them, there was no political change in Zimbabwe, hence the sanctions had to be continued. The other part is that once sanctions are passed in the US, and I think the EU process is a little bit more manageable and a bit faster, but in the US, once sanctions are passed, it takes a very long time to be removed, and I think it's because of their systems and processes. So you see the Zimbabwe situation that you referred to, you probably are aware of the Cuban situation where the removal of sanctions has been incremental. So the process is not necessarily quite immediately responsive to the context in which this sanction operates in the targeted country. And I think the other extreme factor is that these sanctions tend to be sweeping and too generalized, and because they are not quite responsive to the changing dynamics, they either miss key opportunities to address the problems that they are meant to address, or new opportunities to explore new ways of redirecting policy interventions so that the problems that sanctions are meant to address can be addressed.
Well, let's round up our discussion then and ask, so the messaging that is coming from the continent, I mean, from as high up in office as the leader of the AU, the current chair of the AU, Macky Sall, you add to that voice that coming from South Africa, a country seen as the continent's most industrialized, and perhaps it holds a much significant weight because of our own history here. Do you think that these voices are likely to be listened to by this new administration in the U.S., the Joe Biden administration, or is that likely to fall on deaf ears?
Well, I'm not sure how the new U.S. administration will respond to this, but I think that President Biden should be bold and say that the sanctions are not as relevant as they maybe were in 2001 and 2002. A lot has changed in Zimbabwe. So the way forward, in my view, would be to work with and within the AU and SADC to explore solutions for the challenges that are in Zimbabwe, and partly problems to do with democratization, partly to do with economic and social issues. The other thing that has to be done immediately is that over the years since this sanctions policy was imposed, the partnership in Zimbabwe has shifted and focused towards the East and particularly China. So I think the AU and SADC need to have more conversations with the government of China to say, we need your help, partly to convince the West to end sanctions, which will have its difficulties considering the current geopolitical issues. But I think that in terms of creating a broader framework of dialogue that looks at external interest in Zimbabwe and domestic interest in Zimbabwe, a key conversation must emerge and be formulated and led by the AU and SADC, but it should include China and also include the EU and the US.
Well, I was going to ask you about just how fertile the ground is likely to be for China to be that added voice, but you and I will know the conversations that have been had in the past, and some people continue to hold this view that China, when it comes to the issue of human rights, well, you can't exactly say the two in the same sentence. However, let's come back to the continent, the leaders here. Their voices, no matter how big this voice grows, the U.S., what it is demanding of the Mnangagwa administration is the following, and I quote, the Mnangagwa government can show the world that its citizens live in a safe, prosperous, equitable country, regardless of their political views. These are the conditions that the U.S. is saying are necessary for these sanctions to be removed. Do you think that the Zimbabwe government can credibly say that there are no human rights violations when we know that there are journalists who have been harassed and even went to prison? And I think of Mr. Chinono here.
So you raised two important questions, and I will address the China question first and come back to Zimbabwe. I think with respect to China, we cannot escape from the fact that in the past 2 or 3 decades, China has emerged to be a very important global player, but also a leading investor in Africa, and has grown to have close relations with African governments and a good working relationship with African institutions like the AU and the SADC. So to that extent, in spite of our perceptions about human rights and democracy in China, I think we need to understand that dialogue is more important and has to go beyond these perceptions, which unfortunately emerge and mostly are reinforced from the camp of the Western geopolitical axis. Coming to Zimbabwe, I agree that there's a lot that the Mnangagwa administration should do, particularly when it comes to dealing with human rights issues, and there are a lot of errors and mistakes. So I expected that President Mnangagwa would do more, at least to deal or address or resolutely demonstrate that he is moving beyond the legacy of the issue of human rights issues, partly as framed by the West, but partly also as raised by Zimbabweans and the Zimbabwean opposition.
All right.
But I think that the Zimbabwean government has not failed. It's just that the opposition has to also take more responsibility in exploring dialogue and engaging with these multilateral players and African leaders, so that we start to see a shift in attitudes and a shift in the domestic political player to a more tolerant and pluralist environment.
Gideon Chitanga, thank you very much for your analysis of this situation. He is a research associate at the African Center for the Study of the United States at Wits University. All right.